They said my prayers were useless, that talking to God was like whispering to the wind, pointless, desperate, and naive. For years, I let their laughter echo through my house, through my chest, through the spaces where my faith used to live quietly. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't whispering to the wind. I was whispering to the one who controls it. And when he finally answered, his voice shook everything they believed in. Good evening, my dears. My name is Ruth Ann Jefferson. I'm 76 years old. And this is the story of how the same people who mocked my faith ended up witnessing God's hand move in ways none of us could explain. Before I begin, if you've ever been laughed at for praying, for hoping, for believing in something you couldn't see, I want you to stay right here with me. Hit that like button, subscribe to Whispers of Mama Ruth, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because tonight, we're not just sharing a story, we're sharing proof that heaven listens louder than the world laughs. I wasn't born with a loud voice or fancy words. I was born with hands that worked, knees that bent, and a faith that refused to die. When my husband passed away, I learned to speak to God the way a child speaks to a parent, without big words. Just honesty. Some nights my prayers were nothing more than, Lord, please help me get through tomorrow. And somehow, he always did. But as the years went by and my children grew colder, the warmth of my prayers began to sound foolish to them. They'd roll their eyes when I said grace before dinner. They'd laugh when I thanked God for a day's peace. And when I prayed for them, my own children, they called it superstition. I remember the first time it truly cut deep. It was Sunday morning, the one day I still wore my white dress and put on the hat my late husband used to love. As I picked up my Bible, my son Michael smirked and said, Mama, you keep talking to that God of yours, but he ain't paying your bills, is he? My daughter-in-law Sharon laughed so hard she spilled her coffee. Their laughter filled the kitchen, bouncing off the walls, bouncing off my heart. I didn't say a word. I just smiled, picked up my bag, and went to church anyway. But that day, I didn't pray for blessings. I prayed for patience, for the strength to love those who humiliated me. And as I sat in the back pew, the old wooden floor creaking beneath my feet, I whispered, Lord, don't let my faith be wasted. Let them see you for who you are. I didn't know then that prayer would change everything, because sometimes God doesn't answer right away. He waits until the silence hurts enough to make his response undeniable. When I came back home that evening, my house felt different. Still quiet almost. Waiting. Michael and Sharon were sitting in the living room, arguing about something. The rent, the car, life, who knows? I walked past them, still holding my Bible. And as I passed, Sharon said under her breath, maybe if you prayed less and worked more, we wouldn't be living like this. That time, I stopped walking. I turned to her slowly and said, my child, I've been working my whole life. You just never learned to see the kind of work that happens on your knees. For a moment, she looked stunned. Then she laughed again, shaking her head. I smiled, but inside, something shifted. It was like the Lord whispered, don't defend yourself anymore. I will. And from that night on, I kept praying, not for peace anymore, but for truth. Because sometimes, before God blesses you, he exposes what's been hidden in your own home, and in mine. There were things buried far deeper than I ever imagined. When I close my eyes, I can still hear the sound of that old house breathing at night. The wooden floor would sigh beneath my feet. The wind would hum through the cracks in the window. And somewhere, far off, a dog would bark like it was guarding the world. That's the sound of my past. Quiet, simple, and full of the kind of peace that don't cost a dime. Before everything went wrong, I used to wake up before sunrise. I'd boil water for coffee, sweep the porch, and sit there a moment, just listening to the crickets fade and the birds begin. My husband, Henry, would be in the kitchen fixing the radio that never worked right. He was a man of few words, but when he prayed, the house felt lighter, like even the dust listened. When cancer took him, it also took the laughter out of these walls. But I held on to the one thing death couldn't touch, my faith. After Henry passed, it was just me and the children. Michael, the oldest, always had big dreams, too big for this small town. He wanted money, cars, and all the things his daddy never chased. Sharon, his wife, came later. pretty, proud, with a tongue sharper than truth. At first, I tried to welcome her, because that's what Henry would have wanted. But some people don't want love. They want proof, and when you're poor, faith is the only proof you've got. I kept working, kept cooking, kept praying. Every night I'd light a candle in the kitchen window, just like Mama used to do. She said it helped angels find their way to our home. It was my quiet ritual. Sometimes I'd fall asleep in the chair, Bible open on my lap, candle flickering beside me. I believed that as long as that flame burned, God still had a reason for me to wake up the next morning. But little by little, I started noticing how the warmth in my home began to cool. Michael stopped coming to church. He said he was too tired, that faith don't put food on the table. Then Sharon started teasing, saying prayer was the poor man's therapy. I'd laugh it off at first, but you can only pretend it doesn't hurt for so long. One Sunday afternoon after service, Pastor Miller stopped by to bring me fresh bread. He smiled and said, "Sister Ruth, I saw your boy again. Haven't seen him in church for months." I smiled too, but my voice cracked a little when I said, "He's just busy, Pastor. He'll come around." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew I didn't believe them, because faith can move mountains, but it can't always move people who've decided to close their hearts. At night, I'd pray harder. "Lord," I whispered, "don't let my children forget who you are. Don't let the world turn them cruel." But instead of softening, something in Michael hardened. He started drinking. The bills piled up. He'd ask me for money, sometimes the last I had, and I'd give it, hoping it might remind him of grace. But the more I gave, the less he respected me. It's strange how love can turn into a kind of quiet slavery when it's not returned. Then came the whispers from the neighbors. I'd hear them at the store, at the post office. They say Ruth's boy lost his job again. They say that woman he married don't even cook for her. People talk when they see kindness being trampled on. But I never defended myself, because deep down, I kept believing that if I stayed silent one day, God would speak for me. The day that belief was tested the most was the day I found my late husband's Bible in the attic. The pages were yellowed, and the smell of cedar filled the air. Inside, he had written something in his shaky handwriting. "When faith feels foolish, remember, miracles are never meant to look logical." I closed the Bible and cried for a long, long time, because that night, I finally understood faith wasn't my weakness. It was my weapon. From that day forward, I stopped trying to convince anyone that God was real. I stopped explaining myself, stopped defending my prayers, because I knew what was coming. Something was stirring in the quiet, like heaven was inhaling before speaking. And when it did, even the walls of my home would tremble. It started small, like all storms do. A few words thrown carelessly across the dinner table. A sigh here, a mocking smile there. At first, I thought it was just frustration talking. Life had been hard on all of us, but the way Michael started to look at me, that wasn't frustration. It was contempt. And I don't know what's worse, when your child stops loving you, or when he starts being ashamed of you. One night, I was in the kitchen frying cornbread for supper, when I heard them laughing in the living room. Sharon's laughter was sharp, like glass breaking. Michael said something I couldn't hear clearly, and then I heard my name followed by a roar of laughter. I froze, spatula in hand, my heart suddenly louder than the sizzling pan. When I walked in, Sharon was holding my Bible, pretending to fan herself with it. "Oh, look," she said, smirking. "The holy book that's supposed to pay our bills." Michael chuckled, sipping his beer. "Maybe Mama's prayers can turn water into rent money," he said, and Sharon nearly doubled over laughing. For a second, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just what they said. It was how easily it came out of their mouths. No hesitation, no shame. I wanted to shout, to defend my faith, to remind them that every meal they ate came from the same God they mocked. But I didn't. Instead, I walked over, took the Bible gently from Sharon's hands, and said softly, "You may laugh now, my child, but this book has kept this house standing longer than any man ever could." She rolled her eyes, muttering, "Here we go again." And Michael just said, Yeah, Mama. Go talk to your invisible friend." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding my Bible to my chest, whispering into the dark, "Lord, give me strength not to hate my own." Because that's the hardest prayer a mother can pray. Not for her children's success, not for their safety, but for her own heart not to turn bitter. The days that followed were colder. Michael barely spoke to me unless it was about money. Sharon stopped cooking, stopped cleaning, stopped pretending to be polite. They moved around the house like I was some old ghost who'd overstayed her welcome. One morning I found my prayer notes, the little slips of paper I kept in the kitchen drawer, torn into pieces and thrown in the trash. My hands trembled as I picked them up. Each note was a cry to God. Each word now looked like it had been silenced. Later that week, Pastor Miller came by again. He wanted to pray with me. We sat at the table, hands clasped. When Michael walked in, he didn't even look ashamed. "Pastor," he said with a smirk, "you better pray hard, 'cause I don't think God's listening to her anymore." I saw the pastor's face pale, but I just smiled weakly and said, "Maybe he's just waiting for you to be quiet." That silenced him, for a moment. By the end of that month, I could feel something shifting inside the walls. Sharon started whispering on the phone late at night, pacing the hallway, her voice sharp, angry, desperate. Michael came home later and later, smelling of liquor and regret. I prayed harder than ever, but it wasn't the same kind of prayer anymore. It wasn't, "Lord, fix this." It was, "Lord, reveal what's hidden." Then one evening, while setting the table, I noticed Michael's wallet left open on the counter. Inside was a folded paper, a bank receipt, money. Going out, a lot of it, and not to pay bills. My heart pounded as I read. The name on the transfer. It wasn't Sharon's. It wasn't mine. It was another woman's. Folded the paper back quietly and slipped it where I found it. My hands were shaking, but my voice wasn't when I said my prayer that night. "Lord, I won't ask you to punish, just to show truth, because sometimes truth hurts louder than lies ever could." And in that moment, I swear I felt the air shift, as if heaven itself took a breath. That was the night before everything began to unravel. The first sign came quietly, like a whisper in a storm. It was the morning after I found that bank receipt, the one with another woman's name. Michael's car wouldn't start. He cursed under his breath, slammed the door, and shouted for Sharon to come outside. They both argued in the yard, loud enough for the whole street to hear. The engine sputtered, then died again, smoke rising from the hood. I watched from the window, Bible pressed to my chest, not out of joy, but out of awe, because deep down I knew God had started to move. That week, strange things began happening. Bills that Michael swore he paid started arriving again. A job interview he'd been waiting for was suddenly canceled. The company changed direction. Sharon misplaced her jewelry, then found it in places she swore she'd never been. Every little thing that once made them feel in control began slipping away, piece by piece, and through it all, I stayed quiet. I cooked. I cleaned. I prayed. But my prayers sounded different now. They weren't cries of pain anymore. They were steady, calm, like I was talking to someone who had already answered. One evening, Sharon came into the kitchen frustrated. "Mama Ruth, you been praying for us again?" she said with a sneer. I smiled softly. "I always pray for my family," I said. "Well, maybe stop. Every time you start praying, something bad happens." Her voice shook. She tried to sound strong, but fear was creeping in. I saw it in her eyes. The same woman who mocked my prayers now whispered about curses. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, and the rain beat against the roof like it was trying to get in. I sat in my chair by the window, candle flickering beside me, and opened Henry's Bible again. The same verse kept staring back at me. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord," I whispered. "Then let it be yours, Lord. But please be merciful." The next morning I woke up to the sound of Michael arguing on the phone. He was pacing the porch, running his hand through his hair. Something about money missing from his account. "I don't understand," he shouted. "It was there yesterday." He threw his phone on the table and stormed out, slamming the door so hard that one of the picture frames fell off the wall. It was the one of me and Henry on our wedding day. The glass shattered clean across our faces. I bent down to pick it up, my hands trembling. The cut on the glass sliced across Henry's image, but not mine. For a moment, I froze. It felt like a message, not of harm, but of protection, as if God was whispering, "You are covered." By the end of that week, even Sharon's friends stopped visiting. They said her energy felt strange. She stopped laughing, stopped mocking. She started to look haunted, and Michael, he barely came home. The man who once mocked my prayers was now sleeping in his truck, calling strangers for help. One night, around midnight, I heard the front door creak open. Footsteps stumbled in. Heavy, slow, uncertain. It was Michael. He stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his clothes, eyes wild. "Mama," he said, voice shaking. "Something's wrong. I can't sleep. I keep hearing your voice, praying, but I'm not here." I took his hand. "Then maybe, my son," I said gently, "God's trying to call you home." He broke down, sobbing like a little boy. I held him, rocking him slowly, whispering the same prayer I'd said for years. "Lord, protect my child, even from himself." And that night, for the first time in months, I felt peace. Not because they stopped mocking me, but because the Lord had started answering. And when God answers, he doesn't shout. He shakes the walls of your comfort until you have no choice but to kneel. When the morning came, Michael was gone again. But something in the house had shifted. It wasn't quiet anymore. It was expectant, alive, like a breath waiting to be exhaled. And I knew the storm wasn't over. It had just begun to reveal what it came to cleanse. The storm came without warning. One moment, the sky was clear and golden. The next, it turned the color of old bruises. Thunder rolled over the hills like something ancient waking up. By nightfall, the wind was howling through the cracks in my windows, and the trees outside bent as if bowing before a power too great to stand against. I lit a candle on the kitchen table and whispered, "Lord, I don't know what you're doing, but I trust you." The light flickered, and for a second I thought I saw Henry's shadow in the doorway, not as a ghost, but as a memory, calm and steady, reminding me to keep praying. Michael still hadn't come home. Sharon was pacing the hallway, muttering under her breath, phone in hand. She'd been trying to call him for hours, but every time she did, the signal dropped. Her anger was turning into something else now, fear. It was written all over her face. For the first time, she looked small, almost childlike. "Why is this happening, Mama Ruth?" she asked, her voice trembling. I looked at her gently. "Maybe because sometimes," I said, "God has to shake the earth before he can plant new roots." She frowned, confused. "Are you saying this is about your prayers again?" I didn't answer. Because the truth is, I didn't know either. I just knew something was being set right, even if it looked like everything was falling apart. The rain grew heavier. The power went out. The house fell into darkness, except for the trembling glow of my candle. We sat in silence, listening to the storm breathe, until a sound cut through it like a scream. A sharp, violent crack outside. It wasn't thunder. It was closer. Sharon gasped and ran to the window. Lightning had struck the old oak tree in the backyard, the one Michael always told me not to touch. Felt my heart tighten. That tree had always felt out of place, too still, too heavy, as if it carried secrets in its roots. For years, Michael had told me to stay away from it. He'd even fenced off the area, saying it was for storage. But when I stepped outside that night, barefoot in the mud, candle still in hand, I saw the fence torn open. The lightning had split the tree clean in two, and beneath the roots, something glimmered faintly in the wet soil. Sharon followed me, her voice shaking. "Mama, come back inside. It's dangerous." But I couldn't. Something pulled me closer. The rain stung my face. The wind whipped my dress. But I knelt down anyway. My fingers dug into the earth, wet and cold, until they touched metal. A small box, rusted, old. I pulled it free and brought it inside, setting it on the kitchen table. The candlelight danced across its surface. There was a faint engraving on the lid, Henry's initials. But Henry had been gone for 15 years. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were papers, documents, and something that made my stomach drop. Cash, stacks of it, and beneath them, a folded letter. The handwriting was Michael's. My eyes blurred as I read. He'd been taking money from his father's pension and hiding it, telling Sharon they were broke while he built a secret life somewhere else. The account number matched the one on the receipt I'd seen days before. Every word burned like fire. Sharon collapsed into a chair, covering her face. No, he wouldn't do this. But I knew he would, because the same man who mocked my prayers had been praying to money all along. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just whispered, "Lord, you saw what I couldn't. Thank you." The candle flickered stronger for a moment, as if agreeing. Then thunder roared again, and the light went out completely. In the pitch-black silence, Sharon whispered, "What happens now?" And my voice, calm, almost not my own, answered, "Now, my dear, the truth begins to speak for itself." Outside, the rain began to ease, and the wind grew quiet, like the storm had done what it came to do. But deep inside me, I knew this was only the beginning of God's answer. And when heaven decides to reveal what's buried, it doesn't stop halfway. When the morning came, the world was still dripping with the memory of rain. The house smelled of wet earth and candle wax. Sharon was asleep at the table, her head resting on her arms. The little box sat between us, open. The papers, the money, the truth, all laid bare. I didn't touch it again. I didn't need to. What was once hidden was now in the light. I walked to the window and watched the sun rise through the mist. There's something about dawn after a storm. The air feels cleaner, even if your heart doesn't. I whispered softly. You showed me. Lord, now show me what to do. A few hours later, I heard the sound of tires on the gravel road. Michael's truck. He came in soaking wet, eyes red, voice hoarse. "Mama," he said, barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you." He didn't notice the box on the table right away. He just stood there, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. "What happened, son?" I asked, my voice gentle. He took a deep breath and said, "Everything's falling apart. My job's gone. The account's frozen. I don't know what's going on." He ran his hands through his hair, pacing. "It's like God's punishing me or something." And that's when his eyes fell on the box. The color drained from his face. He froze, then slowly walked over. His hands shook as he picked up one of the envelopes. Then the letter. He didn't say a word for a long time, just stood there, staring at his own handwriting. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked like a child's. "Mama, I never meant for you to find that." I didn't move. I just looked at him. The boy I raised, the man I didn't recognize anymore. "Why, Michael?" I asked softly. He sank into a chair, holding his head in his hands. "Because I was tired of being poor. I wanted to give Sharon more than you ever could. I wanted to stop feeling small." His words cut deep, but I didn't let them bleed out loud, because in that moment, I realized this wasn't just betrayal. It was blindness. He'd been chasing a version of life that had no soul. "Michael," I said, "you stole from your father's memory. You lied to your family, and you mocked the same God who's trying to save you." He broke down crying. "I know, Mama. I know. I deserve whatever's coming." But I shook my head slowly. "No, son. What's coming isn't punishment. It's mercy, dressed in truth." Just then, Sharon woke up, eyes swollen, face pale. When she saw him, she burst into tears. "How could you?" she whispered. "You made me hate her. You made me mock the only person who ever prayed for us." He reached for her, but she pulled away. The room was heavy with everything unsaid. The years of pride, of laughter turned to poison, and I stood there between them, the old woman they once called foolish. I opened the Bible on the table. It fell open to the same page as before. Romans 12:19. "Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord." I looked at both of them and said, "I told you once, I don't fight with anger. I fight on my knees, and my God always answers." Michael sobbed quietly. Sharon whispered, "What do we do now?" I closed the Bible and said, "You both do what I've been doing all along. You pray." That night, after they went to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen again. The candle burned low, its light steady, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't pray for God to fix things. I prayed for gratitude, for letting me live long enough to see His justice unfold not in thunder, but in truth. Outside, the wind was calm. The storm had done its work, and in the silence that followed, I heard it, the faintest whisper, soft and certain, inside my heart. "You see, Ruth Ann, I was listening all along." It happened 3 days later. The morning was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of stillness that comes before bad news. I was washing dishes when the phone rang. It was Pastor Miller. His voice was soft, careful, like he was holding something fragile. "Sister Ruth, Michael's been in an accident." For a moment, everything around me stopped. The dripping faucet, the ticking clock, even my heartbeat. I gripped the counter and whispered, "Is he alive?" "Yes," the pastor said, "but he's asking for you." I didn't run. I just stood there staring at the floor, tears burning my eyes. I thought of every prayer I'd ever prayed for that boy. Every night, I'd begged God to bring him back. Every morning, I'd forgiven him before the day even began. Now heaven had answered, but not the way I expected. When I arrived at the hospital, the smell of antiseptic hit me like a wave of memory. The halls were too white, too cold, too loud. I found him in a small room at the end of the corridor. Michael lay there, pale and bruised, a cast on his arm, tubes in his hand. But his eyes, those same eyes that once looked at me with mockery, were full of tears. "Mama," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I don't deserve for you to be here." I sat beside him, holding his hand. "Child," I said softly, "you don't earn a mother's love. You just have it, even when you don't want it." He started crying, shaking. "I lied. I stole. I mocked your faith. And you still prayed for me." I nodded slowly. "Because one day, I knew you'd need those prayers to come back home." Just then, the door opened. Sharon walked in, her face pale and tight. She looked at me with that same defiant spark, smaller now, but still burning. "Oh, so this is what you wanted, huh?" she snapped. "Your prayers worked. He's broken. And now you get to look holy." The room fell silent. Michael looked away. I stood, turning to her slowly. "My dear," I said quietly, "you still don't understand. I never prayed for him to fall. I prayed for him to see." She crossed her arms. "Well, congratulations. He sees now." Her words were bitter, but her voice cracked halfway through. And then, silence, the kind that only truth can bring. I stepped closer to her. "Do you know what's louder than laughter, Sharon?" I asked. She frowned. "What?" "Regret." She blinked, tears filling her eyes. For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. Michael reached out his hand toward her. "Sharon," he said weakly, "I'm sorry. I dragged you into my lies. I made you despise the woman who prayed for us." She broke down, covering her face. The sound of her sobs filled the room like rain finally falling after drought. I placed my hand on both of theirs. "God's not punishing you," I said. "He's healing what's been broken, even if it hurts." Michael closed his eyes, whispering, "Mama, will you pray with me?" And so we did, right there in that sterile white room, with machines beeping and nurses passing by. We prayed. Not for money, not for miracles, but for mercy. When the prayer ended, I felt peace spread through the room. Warm, alive, quiet. Michael was still weak, but he smiled faintly. Sharon just stared at me, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You really believe he listens, don't you?" she asked. I smiled. "I don't believe it, my child. I know it." The doctor came in then saying Michael would recover, though slowly. As they left the room, I stood by the window, watching the light break through the clouds. And for the first time, I saw my reflection not as a broken old woman, but as a vessel of every prayer that had ever touched heaven and come back answered. Behind me, I heard Sharon whisper, "She never gave up on us." And Michael replied, his voice trembling, "That's what faith looks like." When Michael came home from the hospital, the house didn't feel like the same place anymore. The air was softer. The silence wasn't heavy. It was healing. Even the old clock in the living room seemed to tick slower, as if the whole world had taken a deep breath and decided to start over. He moved slowly, still weak, still carrying the shame of what had been uncovered. But there was something new in his eyes, a gentleness I hadn't seen since he was a boy. He prayed before eating. He said thank you again, and when I'd whisper, "God is good," he'd nod instead of rolling his eyes. Sometimes, the greatest miracles aren't in what God gives, but in what he changes inside a man's heart. Sharon stayed quiet those first few days. She cooked in silence, cleaned in silence, even prayed in silence. It wasn't guilt anymore. It was reflection. She'd sit on the porch at sunset, staring into the distance, hands folded, lips moving softly. One evening, I brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her. She didn't speak at first. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I used to think prayer was weakness, but now I think it's the only strength that lasts." I smiled. "That's because it comes from surrender, not pride. But life has a way of testing even the lessons we learn." 2 weeks later, Sharon came home with tears in her eyes and an envelope in her hand. "I lost my job," she said. "They said they're cutting staff. I don't know what we'll do." For a second, she looked like the same frightened girl who once mocked me. But now she wasn't laughing. I took her hand and said, "We'll do what we've always done. We'll pray." That night, she and I knelt together in the same kitchen where she once ridiculed me. Her tears fell on the floorboards that had heard years of my own. And as she prayed, I realized something beautiful. She wasn't asking for money or comfort. She was asking for faith. The next morning, I made her favorite breakfast, grits, eggs, and a little bit of hope. When she sat down, I said, "You see, my child, sometimes God has to empty our hands so he can fill them with something that lasts." She nodded, eyes glistening. "Do you think he'll forgive me?" she asked. I smiled softly. "He already did. You're just catching up to it." Days passed, and the peace in the house grew stronger. Michael started helping around the neighborhood, fixing things for the old folks he once ignored. Sharon began volunteering at the church kitchen. I watched them from the porch, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Quiet joy. One Sunday morning, Pastor Miller came by again. He looked around the house at the laughter, at the light, and said, "Sister Ruth, I told you God would answer your prayers." I smiled and replied, "He didn't just answer, Pastor. He taught us how to listen." That evening we sat together, me, Michael, and Sharon, watching the sunset melt into gold. The same sun that once set on mockery was now rising on mercy. Sharon leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "You were right, Mama Ruth. God really does answer louder than we ever could." I looked at her, tears filling my eyes. "No, my dear," I said softly. "He just waits until we're quiet enough to hear him." The crickets began their song again. Just like in the old days, the storm had passed, but its echoes, the lessons, the forgiveness, the grace, lingered in the air like a hymn only the heart could hear. The years have a way of softening even the sharpest pain. Doesn't erase what happened. It just teaches your heart how to hold it differently. When I look back now, I don't see tragedy anymore. I see transformation, not the kind that makes headlines or brings applause, but the quiet kind, the kind only heaven notices. My hair is grayer now, my hands weaker, but when I touch my Bible, I still feel the same fire that kept me alive when everything else tried to silence me. I sit in this same chair by the window, watching the light fall across the kitchen table, and I realize I've spent my whole life waiting for God to speak, and he did. Not with thunder, not with lightning, but with change. Sometimes I think about how far we've come. Michael has his own little repair shop now. Nothing big, just enough to keep him busy and honest. He brings me flowers on Sundays, not because it's Mother's Day, but because, as he says, every day you're still praying for me. Mama is a Mother's Day. And Sharon? She leads prayer meetings at church now. The same woman who once rolled her eyes at grace now stands in front of others, telling them that mercy isn't weakness. It's proof that love survived the fire. People often ask me, "Ruth Ann, how did you forgive them after everything they said and did?" I tell them forgiveness isn't a moment. It's a daily decision to let peace speak louder than pain. Every morning, when I wake up, I whisper the same prayer. "Lord, thank you for not giving up on me, even when I wanted to give up on them." Sometimes I still remember that storm, the night the tree split, the lightning, the rain. I used to think God sent it to punish. Now I know he sent it to reveal. Because sometimes, before he rebuilds your life, he has to strike the ground and uproot what's been rotting underneath. I think about Henry, too. I imagine him smiling somewhere above, proud that his wife never let her knees grow tired. And I smile back, whispering, "We made it, love. We really did." I've learned that faith isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It just needs to stay through ridicule, through heartbreak, through storms, because one day, the same people who mocked you will come to you for prayer. And when they do, you won't have to say, "I told you so." You'll just hold their hands and let God's answer echo through your silence. So if you're watching me right now, my dear, and you've ever felt small for believing, ever been laughed at for hoping, ever prayed through tears, don't stop, because every word you whisper in faith is a seed, and one day, God will make sure it grows in front of the very eyes that doubted you. I used to wonder why He made me live long enough to see all this, but now I understand. He wanted me to tell you, yes, you, that the same God who listened to a widow's trembling prayers in a quiet kitchen still listens today. He doesn't forget. He doesn't delay. He just waits for the right moment to answer. Louder than you ever could. The evening light has a way of softening everything it touches. It pours through my window, golden and warm, wrapping this old house in peace, the same house that once echoed with laughter, that cut like knives now hums with quiet prayer. Every room carries a memory, some painful, some holy, but I've learned to love them all. I sit in my chair, the same one Henry built for me 50 years ago, and I look around at the fading wallpaper, the worn Bible on the table, the candle that's been lit 1,000 times. This is where I fought my battles, not with anger, not with fists, but with folded hands and faith that refused to die. People think miracles are big and loud, but they're not. Sometimes they look like a son coming home sober. Sometimes like a daughter-in-law whispering a prayer in the kitchen. Sometimes like an old woman finally sleeping without tears. That's what God's louder answer sounds like. Not thunder, but restoration. Last Sunday, Michael and Sharon took me to church. It had been years since we'd gone together. When the choir began to sing Blessed Assurance, Sharon took my hand. Her eyes glistened as she whispered, "Thank you, Mama Ruth, for never giving up on us." I squeezed her hand gently and said, "It wasn't me, child. It was the one who heard me when no one else did." We didn't speak again. We didn't need to, because sometimes silence is just another way of saying, Amen. As I walked out of that church, the sunlight hit my face, and I felt something inside me whisper, "You've done your part." And I knew I had. Every tear, every prayer, every long night, none of it had been in vain. They'd all become seeds. And now, I was standing in the garden of their answers. So if you're listening to me now, my dear, and you've been mocked for believing, laughed at for hoping, or left alone for praying, don't let that stop you. Let them laugh, because one day, their laughter will turn into questions, and when they come to you for answers, you'll have peace instead of pride, love instead of bitterness. That's the real victory. When people mocked me, I used to cry. Now I smile, because the same prayers they mocked are the ones keeping this family standing today. The same faith they called foolish built a bridge strong enough for them to walk back home. And that, my dear, is what grace looks like. Strong, quiet, and undefeated. So tonight, as the candle burns low beside me, I want to leave you with this. Never stop praying, never stop believing, because the God who heard me is listening to you, too. He doesn't need your words to be perfect, only honest. And when He answers, you'll know, because His voice won't sound like thunder. It'll sound like peace. If you've ever been mocked for your faith, or if God has ever answered you in a way no one could explain, tell me in the comments. Let's fill this space with stories of grace, of prayers that were whispered in pain, but answered in power. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Whispers of Mama Ruth, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that He still listens. Good night, my dears. May your prayers find their way to heaven, and may heaven answer louder than the world ever could.